we'll now move on. Our next presenter is Ithamar Theodor. He's an associate professor of Hindu studies at Zifat Academic College, Safed, Israel. He's a graduate of the theology faculty at University of Oxford and a life member of Clare Hall, University of Cambridge. He's published on philosophy in Indian texts and Hinduism, and also on comparative studies in Indian, Chinese, and Jewish philosophy. So today he'll be presenting on the concept of God in the Bhagavad-gita, personalistic approach. So over to you, Ithamar.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just wondering, what is our time frame? When am I supposed to stop?
You have 40 minutes from now. I don't know what the time is in Israel right now, but I've...
36. That's fine. So 40 minutes. Goes.
A total of 40 minutes, and within that 40 minutes, give it time for discussions. Maybe 15 minutes is normally good. So I would aim for around 25 minutes max. That's what I would aim for.
That's fine. A second question, I guess, would you like me to share my paper? I could just read it, or maybe you'd like to see it on the screen. My accent is not that good. You maybe easier to follow. What do you think? I'll share it and see.
Your choice. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll share I'll read it from the screen. So this is a second. Yeah. So this is my paper. It is engaged in the concept of divinity in the Bhagavad-gita. This is not an easy topic, and many commentators, both medieval and modern, have been engaged with this topic in various and creative ways. In this regard, the Susa Silvestri and Alan Herbert write. It might be argued, for example, that the Gita portrays a kind of monotheism in which Vasudeva Krishna, God, possesses attributes such as personhood, omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, eternity. What's that? I'm not sure. Immutability. Besides, he is the source of all excellences, the supreme being, the source, origin, and the solution of the cosmos, as well as its sustainer and support. But things are not that simple. From a philosophical point of view, it is important. Just a second. That the attributes assigned to God be conjointly consistent. Sylvester and Herbert quote Dasgupta, who writes that from these examples, it is evident that the Gita does not know that pantheism, deism, and theism cannot well be jumbled up into one consistent philosophical creed. Their solution to this challenge is to articulate the Gita's concept of God in terms of the philosophy of religion as panentheism, a position often portrayed as situated between theism and pantheism. Sylvester and Herbert have defined a challenge according to which the attributes assigned to God be conjointly consistent. I contend that by adopting a personalistic point of view, this challenge can be addressed satisfactorily. In order to do that, the notion of the person underlying the Bhagavad-gita should be addressed, and moreover, the Gita's poetic nature should be addressed as well. In his book, The Worldview of Personalism, Origins and Early Development, John Rolfe Bengtson states that personalism exists in many different forms. The two best known forms are the American personalism, initiated by Borden Parker Brown, and the French school of Emmanuel Monnier. However, he considers that there are also strong currents of phenomenological personalism, existentialist personalism, and Catholic personalism. Although there are many significant differences between these various forms as personalisms, they also have much in common. Their positions often overlap, and historically they can be seen to have stood in more or less close contact and to have influenced each other. Personalism exists also in Hindu thought, and specifically Ramanuja, representing theistic Vedanta, is considered as such. Indeed, while participating in a conference on persons, I have been designated as a contemporary South Asian personalist. To my mind, it is possible to understand the concept of divinity in the Bhagavad-gita by adopting a personalistic point of view. In other words, once the Bhagavad-gita is considered to be a conversation between two persons, i.e. Krishna and Arjuna, the various notions of divinity make sense and do not get into conflict with each other. As such, I propose to look at these theological portions of the Gita not as philosophical treatises promoting or defending a certain point of view while arguing with an opponent or purva pakshin, rather as a transformative conversation where Krishna gradually leads Arjuna to higher and deeper understanding of divinity through a personal encounter, or applying our model, helping him to ascend the existential ethical ladder. This is part of a larger project, which I won't go into that here, according to his mental state or state of realization. In denoting the term person, some clarification may be needed, as attempting to articulate notions of personhood within Hinduism, one faces a translation problem. The term person is a somewhat Western imposition on Indian culture, and the uncertain status of the notion of person in India is conditioned by the fact that it is foreign to the Sanskritic tradition and has no adequate rendering in any of the Sanskritic languages. When dealing with either human being or the deity, Indian philosophy always worked with other concepts which really import the holistic signification of person. As the term person has no adequate rendering in any of the Sanskritic languages, various terms such as Atman, Purusha, Jiva, Ishvara, Bhagavan, Avatara, and Murti are used to denote both human and divine persons within various contexts. The term person has a long history dating back to Greek-Roman period, where it was used to denote the stage, mass of the actors. It has taken the meaning of a dramatic hero and hence became applicable by the Stoics to every human being, as all are endowed by God to play on the world stage. The Roman law defined the citizens as persons, and as opposed to slaves, they had legal rights and duties. Boethius coined the basic definition of the person, emphasizing the quality of rationality as characterizing personhood. Accordingly, a person is an individual substance of a rational nature. The Christian tradition adopted the term to designate the Trinity, as it viewed all men as brothers. It considered all to be persons, whether free citizens, slaves, or foreigners. In the medieval period, the term person was considered to belong to the realm of responsible action and to refer to an intellectual and morally free subject. Consequently, Aquinas refined Boethius' definition finally to declare that person means an integral and unitary self-subsistent subject characterized by intellectual consciousness, moral freedom, and all properties ensuing from these defining notes. Prominent among these properties were privacy, ownership of natural rights, moral responsibility, being a source of values in its own right, and capacity of initiating interpersonal relationships. It was also such that it could with due precision apply to analogically to divine as well as to human persons. This usage remained as such for hundreds of years, but was later restricted to mean human individuals, whereas its application to the divine was taken as merely anthropomorphic. The translators of Sanskrit works in the late 19th century translated terms Nirguna and Saguna Brahman as impersonal and personal Brahman. Other terminology used by them was to refer to Nirguna Brahman as the absolute and to Saguna Brahman or Ishvara as God. Underlying this obscure usage of terms was the assumption that the Hindu personal notions were not absolute. Against this background, it becomes understandable that the question of personhood in Indian thought has become far too complex and obscure to be dealt with beyond the constraints of modern humanism. Yet the materials for an Indian recognition of the person are present both in the theologies and in various anthropologies of the Indian tradition. We have developed this topic elsewhere in my book on the Bhagavata Purana and have articulated a notion of personhood which I think underlies the Bhagavad-gita. And now I'm offering a different definition of personhood, a specific individual, conscious, and rational being whose nature is enjoyment, desires, creativity, and reciprocal relationships with other similar beings. Having offered a definition of personhood which to our mind fits the Gita, I would like to suggest that understanding this conversation between these two persons, Krishna and Arjuna, requires not only logic, but also poetical sensitivity. It may not come as surprise as Bhagavad-gita is a Gita, song, sacred song or poem. As such, it may be in place to offer a brief critique of language in both its direct or philosophical and indirect or poetical application, and its ability to grasp divinity through philosophy. The nature of direct language and philosophies is to exist within the sphere of rationality and logic. It is characterized by its ability to extract the general and abstract principles from many specifics and particulars in a direct, exact, and concise manner, thereby distinguishing the true from the false. The nature of literature and poetry is different, as it is characterized by an ability to trigger and arouse emotions through an indirect and suggestive usage of language. Edwin Giroux sheds light on this and writes, literature is work of sensibility, that it takes as a principle of some notion of taste, ties it to a certain time and place more radically and meaningfully than any of the forms of expression that have a more theoretical grounding. Giroux emphasizes literature's way of sensing reality, which is by tasting as opposed to rationalizing. He points out that literature ties a taste to a specific time and place more than other forms of expression, which are more theoretical. It may well be that philosophy focuses more on the substance, which is general, and less on the attributes, which are specific. Thus, for example, when saying that a chair is a separate seat for one person, typically with back and four legs, philosophy would relate to the abstract chair and not to any particular one with particular attributes related to a specific time and place. Similarly, logic is formal as it perceives the form of an object and ignores its specific attributes. Poetry, on the other hand, has the ability to intensify the specific and particular qualities of a specific object. Examining a flower, for example, the philosophical approach would concentrate on its flowerhood, or its essential and minimal components which are needed for it to be a flower. In order to do that, it will minimize the perception, or in other words, further a relaxation of its peculiar and personal characteristics in favor of emphasizing and intensifying its abstract and impersonal essence of flowerhood. A poetical approach would, on the contrary, intensify its particular, specific, or personal characteristics. It's being red, it's having thorns for protection, it's being fragrant, and it's being mildly covered with morning dew. At the same time, further a relaxation or minimize perception of its abstract and personal characteristics, i.e. its flowerhood. It follows that philosophical language favors abstraction, whereas poetical language favors specification, i.e. concentration on a detailed and peculiar. The conclusion of this discussion is that in analyzing the personal conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, in which Krishna gradually reveals to Arjuna various notions of divinity, it should be taken not as a philosophical treatise, rather as a personal conversation with poetical aspects. As the notion of personhood is central to our work, we may look at it more closely. The discourse of personhood has not only religious, but philosophical and specifically ontological aspects as well. In other words, the impersonalist believes that underlying the whole of reality, there exists an impersonal or abstract principle. Conversely, the personalist believes that it is ultimately a person who underlies reality. Erozim Koach raises a related question and makes a subsequent claim. Is the person or is matter in motion the root metaphor of thought and practice? That answered, all else follows. This question seems to have deep existential implications. Accordingly, everyone has some idea of the root metaphor of thought and practice, whether it is personal or impersonal, and one's entire worldview is a derivative of that. A truly personal approach, considering that the person is the root metaphor and thought and practice, will assume that the abstract ideas emerge or emanate from a person. As such, in looking at the concept of divinity in the Gita, we propose to accept a personal approach, assuming that a person is the root metaphor of thought and practice, and consequently consider the abstract aspects of divinity to be its derivatives. Based upon that, we aim to demonstrate how the Gita's notion of divine personhood represents various mixtures of these two modes of perception and expression. Having argued that the understanding of the concept of divinity in the Bhagavad-gita requires a suitable definition of personhood, as well as recognition of its poetic nature, along with its philosophical one, we may now look at the various concepts through our methodology of dividing reality. In other words, there seem to be conceptions of divinity seen from the first floor, from the second, and from the third floor. Apparently, some notions of divinity appeal to those on the first floor, some appeal to second floor, and some to those on the third floor, according to the state of mind, their consciousness, or the state of progress along the ethical ladder. For example, one who abides in the first floor, I'll explain that consciousness, what we call the world of Dharma, would be impressed by the avatar, the divine descending to establish Dharma and oppose Dharma. One who is established in the second floor would be impressed by the person in the heart, which is the notion of divinity corresponding to yogic consciousness. One who is seated on the third floor, being established in the liberated state, will see things from a higher point of view. I'd like to stop here and perhaps speak a little more directly and try to say what I'm trying to propose. I'm questioning the central notions of personhood in Western thought, and I'm saying that these are not appropriate to understand the Bhagavad-gita. Basically, I think that a different category of the person, a definition of the person, is needed, and I'm proposing that. I've developed that elsewhere and try to show the methodology. I kind of followed Henry Chadwick's book on Boethius, trying to follow up how Boethius comes to his definition, which is logical. It's based on rationality. It considers personhood to be grounded, or the essence of personhood to be grounded in rationality. And I'm saying that this may not work for the Bhagavad-gita. Basically, it's too rational. Then I'm offering a critique of language, and I'm saying that because from the personalistic point of view, I would say that language, and I get it from a different direction. I'm saying that language has underlying assumptions which are impersonal. Logic is impersonal by its underlying assumptions. The minute we apply logic, we already assume impersonal assumptions, and therefore I'm bringing the idea of poetry. And I think that to understand the Gita's idea of personhood, we have to understand the Gita also as Gita. Gita means poetry, and consider its poetical nature. I try to highlight that logic is formal, and that it tries to grasp the form of the substance, but not its specific qualities. And to be personal, one needs to grasp the specific qualities. So that's the basic arguments I'm presenting. And now from here, I continue. This is the first part of my paper, but the second part is actually dividing the Bhagavad-gita, categorizing the Bhagavad-gita's notions of Godhead according to a model I have. I have a model about the overall way I'm reading the Gita is through three layers: the humanistic layer of Dharma, the intermediate layer of yoga, and the final one is the theological, the moksha level. And I categorize the various notions of divinity in the Gita according to these. Basically, the avatar would be, from my point of view, the first floor notion, and then more mystical forms like the Paramatma, 13th chapter, would be like intermediate, and then the 7th chapter, the 9th chapter, for example, these will be the highest level notions of divinity. So maybe I'll stop here. That's the basic exposition of what I'm saying, and I guess I hope I was more or less clear in my presentation and what I'm trying to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Isidore. It's very good. It's very, very interesting the way you're approaching it. The idea of the Gita, using also the Gita's own structures to understand it itself, which is a very interesting way. Also, it was very nice to see that our article was in there somewhere as well. So it's quite surprising as well. So
I missed the last sentence. It was nice that. What was your last sentence?
You quoted our article, me and Ricardo.
Yeah, of course. No, I answer you. It's a discussion. We're all discussing. Yeah,
absolutely. So it was nice. Absolutely. So, okay, first I'll just open it up for questions for you. If anyone has anything to ask right now, please raise your hand and we'll go from there. Okay, we have Ricardo. Go for it.
I'm kind of embarrassed. I always ask the questions. Thank you very much, Ithamar. Thank you very much for such a nice presentation. Yeah, I'm aware of, you spoke at the end of your presentation, your structured way to understand the Gita, and it's really a very fruitful idea. I mean, and now you can see you are approaching the concept of God in the Gita through it. So I have one question, okay, and which is based on this idea of, as if understood you well, the idea of presenting three different concepts of God that one might find in the Gita, right? And if understood well, these three concepts of God, they depend on the practitioner's consciousness, depending on how the practice or how one sees reality. So he or she would have different concepts of God. Okay, so it's a kind of, I would say, psychological approach to the concept of God, because it depends on the consciousness of the person. But on the other hand, at least in philosophy of religion, and more specifically in contemporary philosophy, philosophers, they speak on the concept of God, on a concept of God from a more ontological point of view. It's like they are trying really to understand what God is, or what properties God has. I mean, and trying to disconnect that question from human perception or human consciousness and so on and so forth. So it's really, I mean, because your approach is of course understandable and correct, of course, because a concept, many people would say, is a psychological concept or psychological notion. It's something that we have in our head, let's say. But we also can speak about concept, and we can speak about the concept of a concept of God from a more ontological point of view. And in this way, the aim is really to find out what God is, what property he has, for instance. And I'm finishing, okay? And it seems to me, when you say that God is a person, okay, and you give your definition of personhood, you are approaching the concept of God not from a psychological perspective, but from ontological perspective. We are saying, it seems to me, that ontologically God is a person. Some people might see him as impersonal, but in reality, he's a person. So could you, I mean, I don't know if I got it right, but if you could elaborate on mainly on this idea, I mean, on the second day you are thinking of concepts as a way of describing a specific entity, in our case, God.
Many thanks, Ricardo, for this great question. Thanks for recognizing the way I'm approaching the Gita through these three levels, and thank you for defining that as psychological. It's indeed a good, true definition that from this structural point of view of the ladder, the three levels, the visions of God and the notions of Godhead are depending upon the person's consciousness, means psychological. And I'm not philosophical, you can say, but psychological. I accept that. It's a nice, thank you for this contribution. But you're also right that I do offer a formal definition, which I hope will be accepted by someone, and that is philosophical, that is rational. And actually, I'm constructing that in dialogue, my own dialogue with the Boethius. I'm trying to see how he establishes a very famous definition, very influential, which to my mind is like in many ways one of the underlying definitions of Western culture, and how I'm trying to differentiate that. But there's also another point in my paper, which is when I bring Erozim Kohak, who says that it is actually a matter, a person or in person, as the underlying idea of reality, existentially. That what is the underlying source of creation? I mean, that it's I see it as something very deep. That statement that we all have some underlying idea of existence, and that may be personal or impersonal, and most of us are not aware of that. I mean, I'm also myself, it's difficult to think in these terms, but it's actually two different ways of considering reality. And I think we have to really go, at least recognize that. And I'm also trying to say that logic is impersonal by nature. So I'm really, I see what you're saying, and I of course I support the idea of trying to look at Godhead through ontology, but I'm trying to bypass that and go into a different direction. You can say more poetical, more psychological. It's true. That's what I'm doing. I'm not really. Maybe I'm not really. Maybe I'm disappointing in the sense that I'm not really entering the hardcore field of philosophy of arguing with pantheism or deism and these, and I'm bypassing that and taking a different route, a different direction, and looking into a more psychological, poetical. It's true. I mean, if I'm disappointing, I apologize for that. Okay.
May I add just a little thing, Alan? Thank you. No, you're not disappointed. On the contrary, but I would ask you one of those three psychological concepts of God. Might we say that one of them is closer to the way God really is, or some of them get it right, or we can't answer this question? Because if we can, then we are also approaching the ontological issue. If you can say that one of those three ways of seeing God is the right one, or at least is closer to reality, to the way God is. Can we say that?
In general, yes, but my understanding of the Gita is that the Gita is very rich with concepts of divinity. There are many concepts of divinity, and as you rightly said, these are perceived according to one's psychological state. But each and every one of these can be categorized in philosophical terms. You take, for example, 7th chapter. Krishna says, I'm the taste of water, the fragrance of the earth, the light of the sun of moon. So that is a particular notion of Godhead, divinity in nature, and that can be categorized in philosophical terms, this particular one. And then you have different ideas. You have the mystical one, the 13th chapter, Paramatma, two birds sitting on the same, that can also be categorized. Or if you take the avatar, the very famous avatar notion, that could be. But just the Gita contains many such, it's very rich. It contains many such notions. And I just think that each one should be treated on its own. And I'm trying to get the whole Gita and point to that psychological transformative path. But actually, from my point of view, if I had to actually define the Gita's notions in philosophical terms, I would try to break it down to probably 10 different notions and do each one separately. And then that will be, let's do the avatar. Now let's do Godhead in nature. Now let's do the mystical one. Now let's see Krishna as a loving person. Now let's see Brahman from the third, in Middle East you have Brahman. Now let's see, a third chapter in Karma Yoga, Yagya and so forth. What is the notion there? So I would just break it down probably to at least 10, something like 10 different notions, and do each one of them separately. And that could be a very interesting work, actually. But we would just have 10 of them, and I'm trying to put it all together into one structure.
Okay. Ruud, if you don't mind, 1 second, I just wanted to add one thing because it's connected with this question here. So please apologize if I'm jumping in front of you. It won't be very long, very quickly. The idea of there's different concepts of God is interesting because you could also frame it not only psychologically, you could also frame it epistemologically as well, in a sense. So we can have ontological principles of God, but also we can have epistemic concepts of God. In other words, you come across that in a different text in Bhagavad-gita, where you have, this verse that talks about 3 expressions of the same one non-dual substance, where we have Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. And each one of them is real. Each one of them is like, absolute, right? It's the same non-dual substance, except they have different qualities. And the way that at least the Goswamis explain, the Gaudiya Goswamis explain the difference is epistemically, that according to the conceiver, you see a different form, or according to the amount of, and it's connected with Shaktis and things like that. So you have the idea that it's about the conceiver. It's not necessarily about the ontology of it. So you can have a concept of God coming from that perspective as well. So it's one thing. And the other quick thing as well, this all just reminds me of that whole 18th century debate between the poets and that whole Enlightenment principles that came out, that they were arguing, people like Wordsworth and even Coleridge to a degree, arguing against these Enlightenment principles, and saying that actually poetry gets you closer to the truth than reason, because reason has so many different problems that come along with it. So that approach reminds me a little bit of that debate that goes on between those 2 areas. Anyway, that's my thing.
Thank you very much for both points. As far as the first point, my main work on the Bhagavad Purana, which was published 2016 as my book on that's my main argument there. I have also structure for the Bhagavad Purana. I basically argue that through philosophy one cannot go all the way up to the higher notions. I build up a ladder of notions in the Bhagavad Purana. I published on that the book and a few articles. And basically, I'm saying that the Bhagavad Purana leads from philosophy to poetry, and that the highest notions are actually poetical. I analyze the rasa theory. I argue an ontological argument, saying that the Bhagavad Purana was constructed by the amalgamation of Vedanta and rasa. I break in Vedanta, we know that there is this differentiation between Vivarta and Parinama. We are aware of that, Shankara and Ramanuja, that polemics, but I also, it's okay, but I also, it's okay, but I also point to that differentiation, that break within the rasa tradition between Vivarta and Parinama, Vivarta being represented by Abhinavagupta, and Parinama through Boja and similar thinkers, and I get it all together. Basically, yes, I agree. That's like it. And if you and anyone else is interested, I can send it by a PDF, the book and other things that related. If you like, I'll be happy to send that.
Please. So, good to hear, for sure. Ruud, you've been waiting very patiently. I apologize for keeping you waiting. Please go ahead.
No problem, Alan. Thank you very much, Ithamar. I think you have a very good point that the notion of person may confuse and lead to misinterpretation of the Bhagavad-gita. But I think the notion is just, it's not just there confusing. The notion of person tends to be generally confusing. In fact, I've tried to look into it for the past 3 months or something. There seems to be no consensus whatsoever on what it means. It can mean things as diverse as personality, just personality, or the human being and its personality. In religion, it can mean the body and soul, the incarnated soul, or the soul embodied with. So there's a mix of all kinds of concepts that qualify. The term seems totally ambiguous. So I don't think it's just with that it leads to misinterpretation of the Bhagavad-gita. I think it's a term that leads to general confusion. And as a suggestion, maybe, as long as we're talking about human persons, why don't we just use the term human beings? A member of the species of Homo sapiens, which is much narrower and intuitively defined than such a weird notion as person.
Thank you for that. Well, one question which comes to mind is the term person applicable also to divinity. I mean, Krishna as a person, not only to human being. And the second question which comes to mind, if we're talking Gita, is what is the ultimate subject? Is the human being the ultimate subject, or perhaps the Atman, the self, the soul? Actually, in my work on the Bhagavata Purana, I'm suggesting that the Atman, the self, is also personal, that there's supreme person and minute person. That's,
yes.
I'm suggesting that because I mean, usually we think about the soul, the Atman, in terms of Satchita Ananda, means like a point of consciousness, I don't know, impersonal point of consciousness. I'm actually suggesting that to really be a personalist, you have to consider the soul, at least potentially, maybe dormant, but at least potentially as a minute person. Now,
Yes.
if you look at this from the point of view of the Bhagavad-gita, that human being would be something, it won't be essential. It will be one's svabhava, one's gunas, one body, but not the ultimate category. So
Yes.
basically, I'm saying that's why I went to the roots of Western thought. I was looking for one of the most important, most influential thinkers in the Western tradition. That's Boelius. He's not the only one, but one of the most influential, and trying to see, question our language. What are the terms we're using, we're applying when we say person? Try to show that we're trying to come and I won't say colonize, but trying to reflect that upon Indian thought, and it doesn't necessarily work always. That's basically, so that's why I'm offering it. But anyhow, thank you for that remark here.
If I may briefly comment to that, I think your second point especially illustrates the need for a distinction between God and human being and person in the sense of personality. Because then we can say, well, you know, Atman has a personality, God has a personality, a human being has a personality. And we can distinguish between those things. You can say Atman or soul has personality, and I can argue against that.
Well, Alan has mentioned the Goswamis a few minutes ago, and they go to that. Rupa Goswami goes into the 64 qualities of the Supreme, of the differentiation between Narayana and Krishna. I mean, the Goswamis go that direction and try to categorize personality, what it means to be a person, what are the qualities of a person, to count them. That's there in the Goswami's literature, which I had mentioned before. But yes, that could be developed. What is a person? What are the qualities? What are the qualities of the human person? The qualities of divinity? And again, the Goswamis did that. Yeah.
But as you mentioned yourself, the term person comes from persona, from the mask that the actors were wearing in Greek theater, which was also the mouthpiece. So it was what they are trying to impersonalize. It was the mask, image they wanted to project. And since we believe that we are that image that we want to project, and the human being is that image, we are the actors on the stage, we come to associate the term person with some kind of being. But I think that's just confusion. And if we stick to using person for personality, human being for human being, and God for God, and self for self, then it clarifies the discussion
Thank you. I accept that. It seems that we're ending with Shakespeare, that all men and women are actors at the world stage. In a way.
Yeah, that has to do with persons. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're just
Indeed.
impersonalizing actors. The
Yeah.
Greeks were not so wrong about.
You're mute. Alan, you're on mute.
Standard problem. Apologize again. So anyway, thank you very much, Ithamar, for the very enlightening presentation.